folks. Thank you for joining us. We're here celebrating Dalia Azim's country of origin with Olga Zilberbourg. Give it up for these two. Thank you so much, all of you joining us here, and thank you so much to all of you joining us online as well. You can go ahead and let us know where you're tuning in from, and I'm happy to tell Dalia and Olga at the end of the night where everyone is tuning in from. It's kind of the fun part of having a Zoom broadcast, but this is the fun part of having people in person, is seeing a whole audience of people right in front of us coming out for literature. That part is very cool to me. I'm Cara, I'm the events coordinator here at Green Apple Books on the Park in San Francisco. And I have very brief business, but I do want to get to the folks of the hour as soon as possible. I wanted to say thank you for keeping your masks on between sips of your beverages. We do have some beverages here. Please do imbibe. We're trying to just proceed as safely as possible. Transmission is really high in San Francisco right now, and we want to give our authors the grace to keep theirs off during the event. So if you just keep yours on between sips of your beverage, that's how we can be celebratory and also as safe as we can. So thank you for being cool and compromising with us. Very briefly, we have a stunning calendar of events, as you can tell by tonight's event. But I wanted to tell you about an event we have coming up on Wednesday. Hernan Diaz, who's the author of one of my favorite books and one of our favorite books, In the Distance, is going to be joining us to talk about his highly anticipated second novel, Trust. We're really excited to have him here. That's going to be this coming Wednesday, right where we are right now at 7 o'clock. And all of our events are free unless stated otherwise. So that being said, please do buy books. Please do buy books from us if you can. I can think of at least 2 books that you can purchase this evening if you haven't already. And if you've been here before, you've heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support Green Apple in putting on events such as these, but you also support these authors who put so much work into these books. And then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able to, please do buy books. So tonight's event is going to proceed as so. We're going to have a bit of a reading by Dalia, and then a conversation between Dalia and Olga, and then we're going to open it up for audience Q&A, and that goes for you folks too online. If you have any questions, we're happy to relay them. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the authors that are joining us this evening. So first, to my right here, Olga Zilberbourg. Olga Zilberbourg's English language debut, Like Water and Other Stories, explores bicultural identity hilariously and poignantly, according to the Moscow Times. This collection received warm reviews from The Common, Los Angeles Review of Books, NYU's Jordan Center, the Manchester Review, Rain Taxi, and many others, and was named a finalist in the 2019 Forward Indies Book Award. Please welcome Olga Zilberbourg. And last but certainly not least, Dalia Azim's work has appeared in American Short Fiction, Aperture, Columbia, a Journal of Literature and Art, Glimmer Train, where she received their Short Story Award for New Writers, and Other Voices, among many others. She lives in Austin, Texas, where she is the manager of special projects at the Blanton Museum of Art, which is beautiful. I would love to talk to you about that later, by the way. Previously, she worked as a researcher at the Daedalus Foundation and as a curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art. She graduated with a dual degree in art and literature from Stanford University and grew up in Canada and Colorado. Her novel, Country of Origin, is the reason we are here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dalia Azim.
Congratulations. Thank you, Olga, and thank you, everybody, for coming. It's really moving. No promises. I'm going to try not to cry, but there's a lot of old friends and new friends, and my dear son Jasper is here, who took my author photo, which I really am happy with, which is not very common for me in photographs. But it's really wonderful to be here and to be celebrating this book, and I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I'm going to actually just read from the beginning of the book, just because I think it kind of sets the tone more than anything else. And then we can have a conversation. I'm looking forward to talking to Olga about this. Hala, 1952. Rima and I watched from the roof as the city burned. It was not a single inferno, but a scattering of fires across the river, downtown, flames devouring buildings, cars burning in the roads, tiny people running around carrying glowing sticks. Smoke painted the sky gray, and the air smelled like how I imagined cigarettes tasted. I hadn't known that anything was awry when I went down to the kitchen for tea that morning, just a quarter of an hour before. There I found Rima engaged in hushed, excited dialogue with Abu Abdullah about an uprising in the streets. As a courtesy to me, Abu Abdullah ducked out the side door as soon as I entered the room. The majority of our interactions involved me staring at the back of his turbaned head as he silently chauffeured me back and forth to school. Once Abu Abdullah was gone, I asked Rima if we could go up to the roof. It felt foolish at 14 to seek permission, but the only way to access the roof was via a set of rustic stone stairs off the kitchen, which I'd always considered Rima's domain. I led and she followed behind me at a slower pace, breathing heavily. Besides school, the roof was the closest I came to experiencing the outside world, so it had always been my favorite part of the house. As far as I knew, my parents never ventured up there, saw no reason to. Sometimes my mother would smell the chickens on me after I'd been up to collect their eggs with Rima, and she would make her displeasure clear. Have you been around those dirty birds again? Buildings burned alongside structures that stood untouched by flame. Do you think this is it? I asked Rima as I stared at the spectacle across the Nile. I don't know what this is, Rima responded in a flat tone, also transfixed by the blazes. After a few minutes, she suggested that we go back downstairs in case my parents were looking for us. We both knew that my mother never emerged from her bedroom before noon, and my father liked to sleep in on days when he didn't have to work. My parents had separate bedrooms and kept to their own schedules. The only time we all came together was around the dinner table for the afternoon meal. When we returned to the kitchen and found it empty, Rima said I should go and tell my parents what was happening. She played up her subservience when it suited her. They shouldn't hear about this from me, she said. I knocked on my father's door first. I'd always been closer to him than to my mother, but recently he'd started talking about interviewing suitors on my behalf, and my feelings toward him had soured somewhat. Sounding far away, my father asked, "What is it?" in a raspy voice. "It's Hala," I told him through the door, as if there could be any confusion about my identity. "Downtown is burning. I think this is something you should see." For months, he'd been making sly remarks over supper. The British don't know what's coming. It's time for them to leave Egypt and take their puppet king with them. Soon we will rule ourselves for the first time in 2,500 years, and it will be glorious. Inside my father's room, I heard drawers opening and closing in quick succession, the rustling of fabric. I stood where I was, fixed to my spot, until he appeared before me, fully dressed in uniform a minute or two later. "What have you heard?" he asked. I explained what I'd seen as his jaw slowly lowered like a drawbridge. "I have to go," he announced before I was finished, and then he was gone, rushing towards the stairs. I decided to let my mother linger in her slumber a little longer. She always rolled her eyes or guffawed whenever my father mentioned the possibility of Egypt's independence. Back in the kitchen, I convinced Rima that we should go up to the roof again. She was in the midst of shucking corn and acted annoyed to be pulled away from her duty. She'd been with my family since I was 3. In other words, she was embedded in my earliest memories. She had 5 children of her own back in El Fayoum, whom she visited once a month on her days off. The fires had multiplied in our absence. Now the glorious Shepherd's Hotel was in flames, burning spectacularly along the banks of the Nile. Flames danced behind the hotel's 4 stories of identical windows, leaping above the roof line. Flagless flagpoles stood waving nothing. Egypt's current flag, green with a white crescent and 3 white stars, was only a few years older than me, established in 1923, when Egypt became a kingdom instead of a sultanate, supposedly more independent after having been under varying forms of British occupation since 1882. We won't be free until they're out of our business and off our land, my father was fond of saying. The British still controlled our foreign relations and communications, and their troops were everywhere. I watched as a wall collapsed into the blaze and heard a distant crowd of people cheering. It had been years since I'd been inside the Shepherds, but I fondly remembered its lush terrace and opulent dining room from my childhood visits. This was after the Second World War, but before 1948, when it was still socially acceptable for Egyptian military men to laugh and smoke with British and French soldiers, the way my father used to when we frequented the Shepherds, which served as an informal headquarters for foreign officers at the time. I felt strange in my civilian clothes whenever we dined there. My father's loyalties had since turned vehemently anti-British, and we no longer went to the Shepherds or to a number of other places where we used to go. Validating my father's staunch boycott of the hotel was the fact that the unpopular King Farouk and his entourage of red Cadillacs were known to frequent the Shepherds. For some reason that wasn't clear to me, my family's British embargo did not extend to the prestigious private school I'd attended since I was 5, where all of my classes were taught in English and we were scolded by our white teachers if caught speaking Arabic. Rima and I were both speechless as we watched the city burn. I don't know how much time passed as we stood there. I'd never been so grateful to live on an island, surrounded by water, a liquid barrier between us and the fires. Most of the time I felt trapped in Zamalek. The only times I left the house were to go to school a few blocks away, and on rare occasions when we crossed bridges to other parts of Cairo to visit relatives or friends. Behind one of the windows of the Shepherds, the outline of a human figure flashed before my eyes. I panicked and reached for Rima's arm. There it was, soft and thick beneath the soft cotton of her galabeya, ready to receive my grip. For the first time, it occurred to me that people could be dying in these blazes, and I felt an overwhelming urge to vomit. Letting go of Rima, I ran toward the chicken coops. The chirping birds behind their cages were there to greet me when I was back on my feet after emptying the watery contents of my stomach onto a pile of spent bedding. I'd always loved the fact that we owned chickens despite my mother's protests. Most things she didn't like she referred to as country, like the chickens on our roof and Rima's headscarf and the ratty turban Abu Abdullah wore. My father swore that he could taste the difference between a fresh and store-bought egg, insisting that his eggs be freshly laid. I'd learned early on not to develop attachments to particular hens. At least once or twice a month, one would manage to free herself from her cage and disappear, presumably over the edge of the roof. Rima and Abu Abdullah had found dead birds in our yard a few times, but always cleared away the bloody wreckage before I could see it. It baffled me how these birds were smart enough to manage escape, but not enough to avoid unwitting suicide. I felt Rima's hand upon my shoulder and turned around to find her standing behind me. No need to worry, Habibi Kalbi. No matter what happens after today, your family will be fine. It struck me that she didn't include herself in this equation. We don't have the kind of revolutions here that they do in France or Russia, she added, making me think of the 1938 American film Marie Antoinette, which I'd seen 3 times in the theater, my only impression of a revolution until now. Here the rich are always protected, Rima said, looking me coyly in the eye. It used to trouble me when she was my caretaker, at the expense of caring for her own children. But it had been so many years now that the guilt had faded. Her youngest was younger than me, just an infant when Rima came to live with us. Just a few months before then, her 5th and penultimate child, who was especially beloved as one of only 2 sons, died in a drowning accident when Rima took her kids to swim at the lake one hot summer afternoon. She was busy hiding under the shade of a tree and nursing her baby girl when it happened. Blaming her for their son's death, Rima's husband banished her to a life of work in the city, ultimately taking a second wife and moving her into the family home. Rima hated going back to El Fayoum, she confessed to me, and felt humiliated to have to sleep in the living room with her children when she visited. I wondered if she was at least happy to see her kids, but I never asked. Let's go back down, Rima suggested now. Go ahead, I told her. I want to stay up here for a while. By yourself? She asked with alarm. I laughed. It's not like I'm going to fall off the edge. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks again to everyone for coming. It's so wonderful to see everyone here. I thought I would start with the question about history. So you do such a great job of, well, the novel opens in 1952, and the backdrop here, the scene at which that Hala is observing from the roof of her building is the Egyptian revolution, when the army ousts the king, um, who is considered to be, right, the puppet of the British government. And at the time, Hala's father is an officer with the army, and as such, one of the heroes of the revolution. But this position becomes increasingly more complicated in the next few years as the events develop. So, and this relationship is really, I think, the core from which that really propels Hala's actions, because she ends up rebelling against her father in a way and leaving Egypt. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the history side of the book, and how did that, how was that the impetus of the story, and how do you think about Hala's relationship with her father?
Thank you. Whether it was the impetus for the story, I knew it was central to the story and to the decisions that she ends up making that kind of alter the course of her own life, and then the generations that follow. It's a multi-generational story that basically spans 30 years. So this is the starting point, and then it becomes a story that goes back and forth between Egypt and the US. And it's about sort of the choices that she makes, and then sort of the legacy of her decisions in a lot of ways. But the revolution was an important place to start the book for me, because basically it was a way to frame a young woman sort of seeing her own opportunities as a human being against the country's revolution. Essentially, as the country is emancipating itself from the British, her life becomes even more kind of confined. Where we start, she's still going to school and still has some experience of life outside of her home. But as the revolution sort of churns in the background, her parents perceive a threat, essentially, with her leaving. So she then becomes a prisoner in her own house. And so that really becomes a way for her to frame her own experience as a young woman, and to question, what it could mean for her to be liberated. I mean, she sees all this, like, this euphoria and this sort of this moment of independence for her country, and everybody's celebrating. Her father, like you said, is a part of it, which I'll get to in a second. But for her, it really makes her, it really inspires her to try to shape her own future and find her own sort of personal liberation. But in terms of her father's role as a longstanding member of the military, I also wanted to explore sort of maybe the darker side of revolution. There's, the really celebratory, euphoric side that we see and that is real. But then there's sort of the ways in which power is consolidated and people kind of take control. And her father's a part of this, and so they have certain privileges and power as a result. But other characters that we then meet later in the novel don't have the same advantages, and in fact, the opposite. They fall on the wrong side of history, and so that's something also that I wanted to explore in the novel. And I thought a lot about it. Wasn't in the book, but the book took me a lot of time to write, 15 years. And as I was working on it, there was another revolution in 2011 in Egypt, which, although very different, there were some parallels that I just were intellectually interesting to me, and just also seeing the military sort of rise to power. I've been staying with my cousin here in San Francisco who grew up in Egypt, and his wife grew up in Egypt, and they're still very engaged with politics there, and have some close friends that have been in prison basically since the revolution. So these ways of like cycles repeating themselves. Maybe that'll be, fodder for another story, but yeah, the relationship between the military and power and the revolution was something that I definitely wanted to explore as a way to wrap that up.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is so interesting, and maybe a conversation for another time about how real historical events affect the writing, especially when you're working on something for such a long time. And another interesting thread, and what you picked up is, or what you said was that the way revolutions affect women is such an interesting and indirect story, and women's liberation, women's freedom. That's another really interesting story, and it's in part related to, I guess, my next question. So the book is divided into two parts. The first part that you read the beginning of opens with Hala in her voice, and we get her story from 1952 until 1957. So she's 14 when we meet her, and she's a very fun-loving child who's interested in everything, and but as her world closes in around her, as her father becomes more and more protective, she's starting to look for opportunities to escape, and so she strikes a relationship with another officer who comes to her father's house, and basically uses him as a vehicle, I guess, or well, she falls in love and runs away with him while her parents are planning a marriage for her. So she escapes that marriage, comes to New York, which is another really interesting story. So she loses a lot in class and status in New York. She becomes an immigrant, but and then that's the first half of the story. There's a big cliffhanger at the end, which you're going to have to read the book to find out. It's a big part of the story. Then the second half opens about 10 years later, and we get a story told about Hala, but also about the lives of the other characters in the book, who are her husband Khalil, her daughter Amina, and her husband's brother Hassan. Right. So I'm really curious about how the structure came to be, and yeah, is this something that you began with, or how did it develop over the course of the writing of this book? It's so interesting.
I wish I'd begun with it. It would have been, I think, a much more efficient process. But I tried a lot of different things. It was definitely a puzzle that I struggled with for a long time to figure out the best structure for the book and ways to tell the story. I actually started backwards. I started with Amina, who's the most contemporary figure, and probably the one that is the one I understood the best in terms of her experience as a first generation immigrant, and also somebody who becomes engaged with the visual arts. But then I knew that I'd wanted this to be a story about an immigrant family. And so I basically kind of wove back through the history to find myself into the previous generations. And then for a long time, I was really trying to flesh that out, as it were. But the structure that I landed on that you just described did not come to me easily at all. I, for a long time, was really wrestling with this idea that I had to go back and forth between all the characters I wanted to juggle. So in the first part of the book, the section, the Hala, Khalil, and Hassan sections, I basically followed them all kind of in sync and was sort of passing the baton back and forth every 10 to 20 pages, which I think some writers can do very successfully with multi POV books, but there was a lot of drag in this book, and I felt like ultimately when I decided to try it this way and approach it more like telling each person's story and more of these like novella length sections, it felt like, okay, well now I can keep momentum and really kind of focus in on one character. And I don't have to, like, I sort of freed myself from this idea that I had to have each person experiencing the same history simultaneously, which was something I was stuck with for a long time, that I had to like really have this equity or something. But ultimately it was like, okay, well, it's really Hallow's story in the beginning. And they were all third person POVs, but I made the switch to the first person with her. And she is really kind of the center of the story. And then it breaks off, kind of breaks open into these other characters that it's their own stories, but it also sheds light on her story and this mystery that you're referring to. But yeah, that was definitely a discovery later in the game.
Yeah, it's really really interesting to know where the story started. I didn't fully expect that answer. So one other question, I think it's both character specific question, and also for me it became a structural question. There's a big thread here about mental illness. When we first meet Hala, again, she's very much a teen. She is very informed by her teen experiences and her teen preoccupations and her sudden, love story. It comes across as very natural. It feels like a romance in a way that we're used to reading, and it's very satisfying in that way. And it is only later when she lands in New York, and among all of the other things that are going on there, she finds herself in the midst of, a kind of a paralysis and unable to do something, unable to do anything. But we start to suspect that there might be something, something about her that's not maybe neurotypical, speaking contemporary language, which she doesn't have access to. So it is only then when her daughter Amina receives a diagnosis herself, right? And then she starts questioning potentially that her mother might have had a mental illness that was undiagnosed, that for me, I had to stop the reading and to sort of reevaluate everything that I had read in the first part of the book, because it really transformed my understanding of the character, and like in a very powerful way. And I also, it's also interesting to me in the way this kind of mirrors, I think. I mean, it feels like a very natural sort of, it's a movement that is not common in novels. Somehow the novels often characters come with a diagnosis or not, and this way, it felt like I was there very much with the character. So yeah, I was wondering to what extent this aspect of her personality was baked into her character.
It was something that, well, I love hearing you say that you had to kind of reevaluate the reading of the first part of the novel, which it's one of those things. It's like, okay, good, that was my intention, really. And also, when you say like we use contemporary language, just to describe it now, part of what I wanted to explore was really to have these two generations of women that might be dealing with the same mental health issues, but in the 1950s and in Egypt, there's no language for it. There's no sort of like, there's just, nobody's looking at these things or naming them or treating them. I got invited to speak to a book club of therapists on Friday, which was interesting and a little bit nerve-wracking with this piece in particular. But one of the women was saying that she was a little bit disappointed to think that it was mental health that drove Hala's decision making, rather than like a push for autonomy. And I was like, well, I don't definitively think it's either. Like, I think that it's both in some ways. And, there's this sort of impulsive behavior of like a romantic teenager who has very little worldly experience, but then the sense of desperation and, these sort of triggers in the environment that could very well unlock some underlying condition. But with her, I think it felt very, it would have been anachronistic to label her or to diagnose her because she wouldn't have been in her time. But I definitely wanted really to kind of keep it really subtle without it being so subtle that you would not necessarily have that impulse to go back and reevaluate it. And I think that was something that came out with revision. I think earlier it was maybe it needed to be amped up a little bit. But when you get to Amina and her experiences, which also I don't think are like, I don't think that they're inevitable. I think she also experiences challenges in her life and traumas that that then kind of open up these same mental health issues with bipolar. And so I wanted this dialogue between the generations and between these women, but also their trajectories are very different. And I also, while the first one may have, well, I'm going to stop there because we're going to keep this kind of spoiler free, but they have different arcs essentially, while they might be dealing with the same thing.
And that was really interesting. And I really do, I really like that. And that was also the reading that I got away from. It's, her decision making was very much her own, and whatever, it's the whole person who's making a decision, and it's hard. You can't separate it out into different pieces of her personality or psyche. It was very, very much a drive. She felt driven. But another really interesting structural issue about this novel, and I love, I think this is me as a reader. I love reading structures of books, but this was really, really interesting. How the stories come together and don't. And I loved hearing you say earlier that you liberated the characters from having to follow the same chronology. It really felt liberating in many ways to read a story in which each character has their own arc and they don't necessarily intersect with one another. And actually they don't intersect in really interesting ways. So for instance, in the second part of the book, Hala's daughter Mina goes back to Egypt in part to look for her uncle Hassan, who had been in prison during the earlier part of the book. And she doesn't know what has happened to him. She really wants to find him, but she's a stranger in Egypt. She doesn't know anybody. She doesn't really have any anchors from which to be finding him. And then we as a reader get to have this exciting privilege to get a chapter written from Hassan's eyes, through Hassan's point of view. And we get to see the part where he's in jail and how he gets out of jail. He becomes a very religious person in jail, and then he ends up by sheer luck working in a neighborhood mosque. And I almost had this vision of misconnection where, Hassan is working in his mosque while Amina is walking by, and they don't connect. And that's a powerful, powerful thing that only a novel can really give us, in that sense of loss, that, two people who really have something in common, really, there isn't a way in the world where they can meet. So and this is a two-part question. So first is, how did you come to write these missed connections. And the second part is maybe an industry question. How did your editors and like what are the doorkeepers of the industry let you get away with it? Just because contemporary novels really seem to rely on having like a very nice arc where things are resolved and people do come together and important characters do find each other at the end. So yeah, did you have any problems getting past your first readers here?
Well, I'm glad that you found it satisfying. I think that it will be a little bit polarizing in terms of, not having things fully resolved in a way that like maybe a more commercial book might wrap everything up really neatly. But I do love books that really need the readers like emotional engagement to kind of put the whole together. I love reading books like that where and some of the books that I read like really early on when I was inspired to write this book, like Zadie Smith's N.W. or Colin McCann's Let the Great World Spin. They are these similarly structured where it's really up to you to kind of make those connections. And I find that really poetic, and I find it's the kind of writing that I love. But yeah, the industry doesn't necessarily love it, and I did struggle with it. I actually had an agent who I worked with for a number of years who really, I probably should have seen the writing on the walls, but she really wanted me to impose like a much kind of neater sort of soap opera arc to it. And ultimately I ended up leaving her, just because we didn't share a vision for it. And I think ultimately with publishing, you ultimately have to find one person that does share your vision, and the editor they ended up working with didn't push back on that at all. She thought it was, worked really well and didn't call for, she certainly had edits that she brought to the table, but it wasn't, I need you to wrap this up or resolve this in a neater way, or by the last page, you have to answer, A, B, and C. I really wanted the questions that the characters have to be kind of as open-ended for the reader, like they have the same access to information as the characters do, the readers do. So yeah, that's something that felt very true to the story for me.
And yeah, it really felt that way for me too as a reader. Yeah, it was a very rare experience of feeling like, oh yeah, this is how it happens in life. I'm not just reading a novel, which is funny, which is, I feel like it's really a mark of an amazing book. But yeah, I wonder if this is a good time to ask for our audience questions, and we have
I think I'm ready to be done with this book because of the very long journey I took to get here, which isn't to say I won't return to these characters. And actually, in earlier versions, I had written past the end point and written, another generation further on. And there was this whole like 9/11 story. And anyway, I at a certain point, I had to really make decisions and make it, I had to condense it in a way that felt true to this novel and to the story I was trying to tell, and I was already trying to take on a lot, and I felt like it needed some sort of maintenance in some ways. I don't think it's the next thing I'll write, but I may return to it, and I definitely been asked that question. Some people, I know that you read it, want answers. I'm not sure that I'm going to deliver them, but I appreciate the desire to want to know. There was no real schedule that I could keep in a lot of ways. I'm a mom, I have 2 kids, but I also have always worked full time. And so it was really sort of about finding time when I could. A lot of that was on the weekends, and my husband's also a creative person, so often we would trade off. Like I would take a Saturday, he'd take a Sunday, or vice versa. So a lot of it's really helpful for me to have like a big span of hours. It's hard for me to get a lot done if I only have like an hour at a time. I feel like I'm just getting going and getting some work done, but I can get a lot done if I have like 5 hours to write. And I also, I sort of made retreats for myself. I live in Austin, and there were some places that I got some formal retreats, but I also would like, you know, my friends were leaving town for the weekend, and I asked if I could move into their place. So I just was very proactive about kind of finding space and time alone to do it. But that's part of, I think, the slow train method of writing this.
I should ask, the Bay Area art scene is a big part of this book, because Amina ends up studying at Stanford, and she for art is something that she does. And how much of that is based on like the real art scene, or did you have like real models? Like there's one important character. He makes the art out of an ant farm that was really exciting to read about. Where can I see it?
I don't think you can see it. I mean, it's possible that I don't know, inadvertently cribbed somebody's art in my book, but really the San Francisco stuff is, I think it's broader than San Francisco, was really and I think when we were in dialogue, you said it almost feels like a caricature. I feel like in some ways, like looking back on some feminist art from the 60s and 70s, it feels a little caricaturish and over the top, but that was that's the work that she first encounters as a young person who's getting interested in art. But the art that you're referring to comes out of the land art tradition. So she meets this artist who's working in that tradition, works in the landscape that are destination driven. I know my friend here just went to see Donald Judd's Destination City in Marfa, Texas. But that's one of them that I have seen. I haven't seen a lot of them, but it's definitely like it's a very romantic concept to me. The way that like art can transform the landscape, and then people who have this like kind of pilgrimage mentality to go see these artworks. When I was doing my conversation with a friend in New York, whose book is at the front, Emily Hall's The Long Cut, which is all about art. She was saying that James Turrell, who's a famous land artist and is working on his like magnum opus, Rodin Crater, he said something which I hadn't heard. He said that the experience of his work starts like the minute you leave your house. So it's sort of like this intention, you know, to go and see the work. And so it's like engaging with it in this way of like, I'm going to go to this and experience it. And then the way that it transforms the landscape.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Hi, Dalia.
Hi, Carrie.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. But I guess along those lines, I wanted to ask about your process of visualization, which I guess is maybe a question about your creative process, but specifically with like the 1950s Egypt, because I feel like you tell that so vividly and beautifully. And I feel like I have the privilege of having seen some of your black and white photographs of your family in Egypt from, I don't know, 1996, something like that. But and those came to mind reading your work. But I guess I was just wondering, like, your process of visualizing, especially that particular era of Egypt, and anything you can share.
Sure. Well, you and I, and probably a lot of other people in this room, really love photographs. I think photographs are amazing tools for, you know, I love them as artwork, but I also love them as like research tools. And I in some ways, I think that like my creative imagination was opened up by, like, as a young person, looking at photographs like from my family's archive and trying to sort of imagine or understand. My parents immigrated from Egypt in the 70s. And so I grew up going back and forth to Egypt. I was born in Canada, but just trying to imagine that story and that backstory for my family and the times that they lived through was like that was a big sort of creative inspiration for me, and certainly for this book. But photographs, I think, are just an incredible way to try to engage. Well, first of all, to get the details right. And Cairo is a place that's changed immensely in the past 70 years. Like, if I tried to describe the Cairo of 2020, it wouldn't reflect, what it was 70 years ago. So just actually finding resources that can help me imagine myself into that time is really helpful. But it also just gives it's great for world building. It's great for describing architecture and city life and, what people are wearing. Not something that's changed incredibly in Egypt. It went from being much less conservative to more conservative. So just in terms of getting those types of details right. And I would say that my tendency is to start with the kind of cerebral stuff, like the interiority of characters. So I have to really work to immerse myself in the physical world of the characters. And I just think back to some of the earliest advice writers get that's just so useful still, is just to engage the five senses, and to really think about how to see, smell, hear, taste, all of that. And so as a way to really deepen and enrich the world of these characters.
And speaking of that, about that, the image of the chickens on that roof is so perfect. It really engages a lot of senses, just that hen house on the roof. But yeah, the image of the roof itself, do you have a story about that, how that came to be? Because, it becomes such a big part of what happens to Hala, that roof.
Yeah, that a couple people have picked up on that who have read the book. Like the house that she grows up in feels like a place that you've been. It feels, and it's true. It's based on the house that my grandmother lived in until I was 15, which was this sort of sprawling, decrepit, place from the 1900, basically. And it was. And I spent a lot of time on that roof, and there were hens up there. So that was very much drawn from my kind of sensory and physical experience of being in that house, and the sort of the back stairs, like the servant stairs versus the main staircase. So that, in some ways that house was a character that I've been thinking about and writing about for a long time.
Dalia. I know you've been writing short stories for many years, so I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about obviously the obvious challenges and opportunities that differ between writing a short story. But how would you describe kind of the process of being more used to writing short stories? That was a long process, but what have you learned from that? What is anything that is surprising?
I think we shared a lot of short stories back in the day, and I love short stories, and I love reading short stories. I love Olga's collection. I love for me, I felt like I could see myself going back to them at some point, and in some ways it might be a better way for me to kind of re-engage with fiction when I'm ready to do that again. But I think that there were advantages and disadvantages to changing into this form. In some ways, I felt like when I was writing stories, I felt sort of frustrated that I had to start wrapping it up, around, I don't know, I wrote long short stories. So around page 15, I'm I need to start winding down. And I didn't necessarily want to do that. So a novel was a really great kind of canvas for just continually opening up. But in some ways, the limitlessness of that was a challenge for me that I think I had to really wrestle with and figure out, because it was well, I can just do anything and go anywhere, and I can just follow every idea I have, and all these threads, and you can just end up, with a sprawling mess, which I did for a long time. So I think I really love the opportunities it gave, and the ways that it really allowed me to to wrestle with different perspectives, which I think you can do in short stories. I think it's more challenging. I mean, I've certainly seen it done, but I think a novel is like it's a more welcoming space for that, for sort of juggling different POVs and exploring things from different angles. That being said, I do think the next novel I write will be from a single perspective and chronological, but we'll see. I'll probably change it, but yeah, thanks for asking.
Actually, related to that answer, I'm always curious, with creative processes, you do have to let some ideas go, right? Like there's a process of saying, okay, next one. Are there any ideas or things that you're willing to reveal that you wanted to kind of box up and explore?
I feel like most of what I wanted to get into the story was in the story, and it was more just sort of being disciplined about it. Like I had to cut a lot of like the history that I researched pretty thoroughly to write the book. There was a lot of like Egyptian history that at a certain point it felt like I was just kind of showing off my research. It didn't feel intrinsic to the story. There's certainly a lot of episodes that I'd be interested in exploring later. I don't know if I could pick one specifically to share right now that would be, I don't know, easy to share or be that interesting in this context. But there's a lot of that where it's like, well, there's all these like moments that I wanted to capture, but it didn't serve the story because at this point they were in New York and it just didn't fit. I alluded earlier to this like 9/11 story, which was about a young woman who basically wants to kind of shed her Arab identity in the wake of 9/11. And that's something I might explore. I don't think I have an interest in writing about 9/11 at this point in my life. It was just sort of emotionally draining and not very creatively generative at the time. But that's something that it was like a big component of the book for a long time that I dropped, but without regret, really. So I think it was really kind of about stripping things away. In the end, it was a much longer book. I think when I started writing this book, there was a lot of romance about like the big, like important books. And so I was like, I'm going to write a 500-page book and show people what I know. And I just over time, I've also just come to admire like really economical novels where there's just like nothing extra, and those are some of my favorite books. In fact, like books that are 800 pages, I usually feel like they're 200 to 300 pages too long. So yeah, and in the end, it was a lot of like kind of shaving away stuff, but I don't know. I think I'm kind of done with it. I think I'm ready to move on.
I don't think we had a question. Yeah.
From more visual side, so I'm curious about how you arrived at the title.
The title, well, it kind of seems obvious, like in retrospect, it fits the book very well, but it wasn't what I had for a long time. I called it The Survival of the Species for a long time because biology was a bigger component, and it's still metaphorically a component, and it's something that Amina, a career path that she pursues for a while. But I don't think there's any spoilers to share this, but basically all the characters kind of seek opportunities abroad in order to advance their lives. They feel limitations in Egypt, and one character goes to England to pursue an education, and then his visa is denied. And the reason that they give for that is country of origin, which in a much less dramatically interesting fashion happened to my father when he applied for insurance through Geico, like once upon a time. And I was like, well, that's fascinating and racist. So I borrowed that, like a lot of the book is like borrowing things and, kind of collaging them in as they fit. So that's the story of how I arrived at the title. So it actually does appear in the book, but pretty late. But I think it, like a lot of titles, like it applies to other aspects of the book as well. With the cover, I did get a say, which is nice. I have heard from friends that they haven't necessarily had that. They haven't been engaged, but the artist Neon Cho is somebody that my editor had worked with before, and she read the book. I assume that's common, but I didn't necessarily expect that. And she really, I think, internalized it in a really beautiful way. And I had 4 options, and This was my favorite, and I kind of crowdsourced, and it was a lot of people's favorite. We did some work on the typeface. They had a very contemporary typeface. Yeah, I like where we landed with it. But yeah, so I got some input, but I don't take credit for it. It was, I think, a really great designer.
Maybe one last question.
Workshop the book, and if so, what elements were useful and what elements were maybe let you down, blind alley?
I did workshop the book. I have a great community of writers in Austin that I shared the whole novel with and pieces of the novel with over years. They asked good questions. I think they were really good with the sort of structural piece. With this agent that I worked with, who then sent it out to other readers, I got some advice that some of it was helpful. Like at one point I had extra perspectives in there, a couple of characters that appear, but you don't see their perspectives, and they encouraged me to make choices, which I think was good. But then, yeah, I went down some blind alleys. I do think I'm a little bit too open to feedback in some ways. Like some people are like, nope, this is my vision, stay away. I usually can, like, if somebody tells me something's wrong, I'm like, that's a good point. And so I spent a lot of time, I think, exploring things that weren't necessarily generative. But yeah, I think having people read your work is really essential. It's hard to have perspective on your own work, and just being part of a community of writers has been really important to me.
But I really do admire the decisions that you did make. It's a wonderful book, and I hope all of you read it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Olga.
Can we give it up one more time for Dalia and Olga, please? I'm very appreciative of your time and talents and being here. So I'm gonna set, if you're willing to sign books, I'm gonna have Dalia at the back desk here, where there's a book standing there, and we'll wrap the signing line around the desk. If you need to know where to go, I will gladly tell you. Books are available at the front. Also have many other things available in the bookstore, so please do make yourselves comfortable, and thank you once more for joining us.